this week we'll be talking about, we'll be beginning our section on animal anatomy and physiology. And we'll be talking about digestion and nutrition for this week. Okay, so a brief overview of what we'll be talking about. So first of all, food is taken in and taken apart and then taken up in the process of animal nutrition. In general, animals fall into three separate categories, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. So there's herbivores who eat mainly plants and algae, carnivores who eat other animals, and then omnivores who regularly consume animals as well as plants or algae. Most animals are also opportunistic feeders, meaning that they eat food outside of their standard diet if their usual foods aren't available. So like different environmental pressures may force them to consume other like irregular foods that they wouldn't normally eat. Okay, and throughout the presentation, I'll also be mainly going over like three key points. The first one being animal diets, the second one being food processing, and the third one being the mammalian digestive system. Okay, so the first key point. So an animal's diet must supply chemical energy, organic molecules, and essential nutrients to the animal. So the first one, chemical energy, it's basically used to convert, or it is converted into ATP, and which is then used to power cellular processes that are necessary for the animal to survive. And organic building blocks are used to synthesize a variety of different organic molecules, which we've learned about before. And finally, essential nutrients are required by cells and must be obtained from dietary sources.
So I had a quick question on the second supply. So when you say organic building blocks, do you mean by like, carbon and, various elements?
Basically, it's more basically, yeah, it is, but like the elements are basically used to create other things like amino acids and carbohydrates, things like that, which are kind of used, or that's what we refer to as by organic molecules.
Oh wait, so basically macromolecules?
Yeah, like
Okay.
yeah, the building blocks for macromolecules.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so essential nutrients, substances that an animal requires but cannot assemble from simple organic molecules. These are what we refer to as essential nutrients, because they are nutrients that you can't really obtain from anything other than the diet, since they can't be synthesized by the animal itself. And there are also four main classes to these essential nutrients, which are essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals. All right, so essential amino acids, there are a total of 20 amino acids, but not all of them are considered the essential ones, because you can synthesize about half of them using the molecules that you can get from your diet, and your body basically synthesizes it itself. But then the remaining around 9, which are listed on the right side, that your body cannot synthesize by itself, then those are called essential amino acids, because you must obtain them from the food in like a prefabricated form. So they have to already be there in the food, and then you just take them in through your food. So examples of complete proteins would be meat, eggs, and cheese. And these are called complete proteins because they provide all 9 of the essential amino acids. On the other hand, most plant proteins are referred to as incomplete proteins, since they do not provide every single one of the essential amino acids that the body requires. So for example, corn lacks sufficient tryptophan and lysine, and beans lack sufficient methionine. So therefore, vegetarians need to eat specific plant combinations to get all of the essential amino acids, because once again, if you just eat one source of the or one type of vegetable and it happens to lack some of the essential proteins, then you will find that you can't produce the other, or the specific amino acid that's lacking. So yeah, vegetarians have to eat a combination or an assortment of different vegetables. Okay, moving on to essential fatty acids. Animals, for the most part, can synthesize most of the fatty acids that they need. However, there are still some essential fatty acids that need to be taken in from the diet. So these mostly include certain types of unsaturated fatty acids. An unsaturated fatty acid is essentially one in which one or more of the, there are one or more double bonds. So fatty acid deficiencies are rare, but that's because animals are typically able to obtain the quantities of essential fatty acids that they need. Okay, moving on to vitamins. Vitamins are organic molecules that are required in the diet in small amounts. And in total, there are 13 vitamins that are essential for humans. And they are also categorized into two separate categories, one being fat soluble and the other being water soluble. So on the right side, I just gave a small table. It doesn't list all 13 of the essential vitamins, but it's like a brief list of the significant ones that many of us have heard about. So for example, vitamin B and C are water soluble, and vitamins A, D, E, and K are all fat soluble. Okay, minerals. Minerals are simple inorganic nutrients, and they are usually required in very small amounts. So examples of these would be iron and sulfur, and quantities of these minerals that should be taken in can range from less than 1 milligram to around 2,500 milligrams per day. Ingesting large amounts of certain minerals can actually upset homeostatic balance and lead to health problems, which is why these minerals often are required in such small amounts. So an example would be too much sodium can contribute to high blood pressure. Okay, malnutrition and undernutrition. So first, I guess I'll discuss the differences between the two. So malnutrition is the failure to obtain adequate nutrition from an animal's diet. So an example would be protein deficiency, which is a type of malnutrition that stems from insufficient amounts of essential amino acids in the diet. On the other hand, undernutrition is what results when a diet does not provide enough chemical energy. So this could cause, let's say, less loss of muscle mass, it could cause irreversible damage to the body, and it could also use up a lot of stored fat and carbohydrates. So both of these are problems that can cause deformities, disease, and death. Okay, the second key point. Okay, the main stages of food processing are ingestion, digestion, absorption, and finally elimination. So ingestion is the act of eating. Digestion is the process of breaking down food into smaller molecules. Absorption is the uptake of nutrients by cells. And finally, elimination is the passage of any undigested material out of the digestive system. All right. And going back to digestion, there are two types of digestion. The first one being mechanical digestion, which is the process that increases surface area of the food by breaking it down into smaller pieces. Chemical digestion, on the other hand, is what splits food into tiny molecules that can pass through membranes and be taken up by cells. And the process that does split the food into tinier molecules is called enzymatic hydrolysis. And it does this by splitting the molecular bonds between different molecules or food molecules. Okay, there are also different types of feeders that we'll go over before we jump into like more of the specifics. So the four that are mentioned here are suspension feeders, or also called filter feeders. These animals basically sift through small food particles from the water, and most of them are aquatic animals, of course. So an example would be baleen whales, sorry. And the second one is substrate feeders, who tend to live in or on their food source. So an example would be caterpillars, who generally stay on the leaves that they live on. And then fluid feeders, like mosquitoes, suck nutrient-rich fluid from a living host. And then finally, bulk feeders, an example would be snakes. They eat relatively large pieces of food. Okay, now the difference between intracellular and extracellular digestion. So in intracellular digestion, food particles are engulfed by phagocytosis, which basically wraps them into something called a food vacuole. And the food vacuoles then fuse with these organelles called lysosomes, which contain the hydrolytic enzymes that are used to break down the food molecules that are stored inside the vacuoles. And then extracellular digestion in food is first broken down outside of the cells, and this occurs in compartments that are continuous with the outside of the animal's body. So an example of a more simple body plan in which extracellular digestion is used would be a gastrovascular cavity, which is illustrated on the right. So you basically have like a cavity in the animal's body that is basically connected to the mouth. And like when food is ingested into the animal, it enters the cavity and is broken down by digestive enzymes that are released inside that cavity. Now, in more complex animals like humans, we have the entire digestive tract, which is also called the alimentary canal. So the alimentary canal would just be like the entire process in which the food goes through the mouth and eventually out of the anus.
Could you explain the phagocytosis?
Okay, so phagocytosis is a process basically in which like a cell's membrane kind of wraps around like something that's on the outside of the cell, and it forms like another compartment that kind of allows what was outside the cell to enter the cell. So yeah, so like the if you originally had a cell with just the cell membrane and there's something on the outside of the cell, and in this case it's food particles, then the membrane can kind of like wrap around it and kind of bring it into the cell, and all of those food particles would end up inside this like pocket that's called a food vacuole.
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the third key point, this is where we kind of go over the entire anatomy of the body. And so organs specialized for sequential stages of food processing form the mammalian digestive system. Okay, and here's like a small picture that kind of has the main organs that are good to know, which we'll talk about in the following slides. Okay, stages of food processing. So food begins at the mouth, of course, and then it's pushed along the alimentary canal that we mentioned earlier by a process called peristalsis. And this is essentially like, these are essentially the rhythmic contractions of muscles in the walls of the canal that, you know, push the food down towards the stomach. And there are also valves called sphincters that regulate the movement of material between different compartments of the alimentary canal. And there are also accessory glands throughout the canal that secrete digestive juices through ducts. So one of the first examples would be salivary glands, which are near your mouth, and they secrete digestive juices that begin digesting when you like chew your food. And then as you progress down the alimentary canal, you'll run into the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder, which further secrete digestive juices to aid in digestion. So, okay, so the first step is always the oral cavity, which is also where mechanical digestion takes place, because you use your teeth and you chew to break the food down into smaller pieces that are easier to digest through chemical digestion. So as we mentioned earlier, there are also salivary glands that deliver the saliva, which also contain the digestive enzymes. This basically lubricates the food to make it easier to go down your like alimentary canal, and it also helps begin the digestion, the chemical digestion. So salivary amylase, which is found in the saliva. It breaks down the glucose polymers into chewed up food particles. And mucus, which is a viscous mixture of water, salt cells, and glycoproteins, is also found in saliva. Okay, after the food kind of gets chewed up in the mouth, it will begin moving down the alimentary canal through the pharynx or throat, and which is like that. The throat is basically a junction that opens to the esophagus and the trachea. Whereas the trachea leads to the lungs, the esophagus connects to the stomach. So obviously you want the food to go down the esophagus. To prevent the food from entering the trachea and into the windpipe when you swallow, we do have an epiglottis, which is like a little kind of valve that prevents the food from entering the lungs. Failure of this swallowing reflex can lead to like coughing, because like bits of food will end up in the windpipe. Okay, and then as the food goes down eventually into the stomach, that's where the main chemical digestion actually takes place. So the first part is the stomach, which stores food and secretes something called gastric juice. Now the stomach generally stays at a pH level of around 2, which is highly acidic. And this is where the gastric juice begins to denature proteins and convert the food into a pulpy acidic fluid called chyme. This also, like the acidic environment also kind of helps kill a lot of bacteria with its low pH level. And the gastric juice itself is made up of hydrochloric acid and pepsin. Pepsin is a protease that cleaves proteins into smaller peptides. And okay, so that basically means that it's an enzyme. And it's also maximally active at around 2 pH. So they go hand in hand, because the stomach provides the ideal environment for the pepsin to operate. And we also have cells called parietal cells, which are in charge of secreting the hydrochloric acid. Well, they actually don't secrete the hydrochloric acid as an acid, but they secrete the hydrogen and the chloride ions that are necessary to make the hydrochloric acid. And then the sheath cells are the ones that secrete pepsinogen, which is like the inactivated version of pepsin. And when the pepsinogen comes into contact with the hydrochloric acid that comes from the parietal cells, then that's when it becomes activated into pepsin and can be used to aid in the digestion of the food. And also we have mucus again to protect the stomach itself from the highly acidic mixture that is used to digest the food. So that prevents us from harming ourselves. Okay, after the stomach, the food enters the small intestine, which is also the longest section of the alimentary canal. It is it is one of the major organs of digestion, as well as where a lot of absorption of nutrients actually takes place. And the duodenum, which is the first portion of the small intestine, is where the pulpy fluid that the food has become. It's called chyme. It's basically where the chyme is mixed with digestive juices from other organs. Okay, so as I said, in the duodenum, you'll have enzymes or digestive juices from other organs. And one organ that does this is the pancreas, because it secretes enzymes like trypsin and chymotrypsin into the duodenum to aid in the digestion. And the liver, which is another organ, it's where bile is produced. Bile basically also aids in digestion and absorption of fats in the small intestine. And then we have the gallbladder, which stores bile. And since all of these kind of digestive juices all culminate in the duodenum, it's where most of the enzymatic digestion occurs. And the other portions of the small intestine are mainly for absorption. So yeah. So you can kind of think about the small intestine as where like most of the digestion kind of ends up. So you have digestion, and then a majority of the nutrients are absorbed in the rest of the small intestine. Okay, villi and microvilli are both very important because they basically help greatly increase the overall surface area inside the small intestine. Now, this is important because a greater surface area basically means a greater rate of nutrient absorption. And like in the image below, you guys can kind of see how if you take like a small cross section of the small intestine itself, it doesn't really appear to be too great of a surface area. But if you zoom closer, you have all these folds inside the intestinal lining. And then if you zoom in even further after that, you'll see the villi and the microvilli, which just completely magnifies the amount of available surface area that's actually there. So that's why the rate of nutrient absorption can be so high. Okay, now we also have the hepatic portal vein, which carries any nutrient-rich blood from the villi capillaries to the liver and to the heart, which then pumps it to like distribute it, the nutrient-rich blood throughout the body, wherever it's needed. And finally, well, we have the large intestine. So the colon is the main portion of the large intestine, and its job is mainly to absorb water and electrolytes from any undigested and unabsorbed food. So since this the large intestine is basically what where the food goes after the small intestine is done, like, or after the food goes to the small intestine, it's most of the actual useful nutrients are already absorbed by the latter parts of the small intestine. So basically any food that still remains is generally the undigestible and unabsorbed parts. Okay, so the large intestine also houses bacteria that live on the unabsorbed organic material. And we have the cecum, which aids in the fermentation of plant material and connects the small and large intestines. And then we have the appendix, which is an extension to the human cecum. And it plays a very minor role in immunity, but most people basically refer to it as a useless or vestigial organ. So meaning it may have had like a bigger use like further along our evolutionary history, but as of right now, it's mostly seen as a more useless organ. And then finally, the food that's unprocessed is or turns into feces, which is just waste matter that includes all of the undigested material and bacteria that ends up in whatever remains from the food. And it becomes more solid as it moves to the colon, and it's eventually stored in the rectum and eliminated through the anus. So I think that was the last slide. That covers all of the anatomy in the digestive system. So now I guess we'll move to a Kahoot. It's like a very brief Kahoot. It's like, I think 5 questions or something. So yeah.